Today's passage is Psalm 3 verses 1 through 8. Let's read together. Lord, how many are my foes? How many rise up against me? Many are saying of me, God will not deliver him. But you, Lord, are a shield around me, my glory, the one who lifts my head high. I call out to the Lord, and he answers me from his holy mountain. I lie down and sleep. I wake again, because the Lord sustains me. I will not fear though tens of thousands assail me on every side. Arise, Lord, deliver me, my God. Strike all my enemies on the jaw. Break the teeth of the wicked. From the Lord comes deliverance. May your blessing be on your people. Amen. We often hear the saying, life is a series of hardships. This means we frequently face situations that are not easy. Many times we struggle with our health, our finances, concerns for our children, family problems, and so on. As I visit and fellowship with many of our church members, I hear all sorts of stories. How wonderful it would be if there were only good things to talk about. But we face so many difficult things. There are situations that cannot be heard without tears, and many that leave a heaviness in my heart as I listen. I often find myself praying, Lord, why must we have it so hard? Why must we who live as believers have such a difficult time? And there are countless times when the prayer, Lord, please resolve this, simply wells up within me. While all hardships are difficult, the ones that arise between people can be particularly hard to endure. I once read a survey about when people feel the most humiliated in their relationships. The first was, when their existence is ignored. When my efforts, my words, and my actions are rendered meaningless, when they are dismissed, when I am treated as if I don't exist, that is when people feel the most humiliated. The second was when they are betrayed in a trusting relationship. When long-held trust, affection, friendship, partnership, and love are shattered in an instant by selfish calculation or greed, that betrayal doesn't just destroy a relationship, it carves a deep wound of humiliation in the heart. And the third was when they are publicly shamed. People feel extremely humiliated when they are insulted in front of others, when their private matters are exposed, when they become an object of ridicule, and when their dignity is trampled. How about you? Have you experienced these things in your relationships? Those are truly difficult situations to navigate. I am someone who loves people and enjoys relationships, but when a deep misunderstanding shatters trust, it is incredibly hard. And when that leads to being ignored or publicly shamed, I can be overwhelmed by emotions that are hard to describe. We often hear the saying, you can't trust people. While that might sound true, it's also upsetting. It's a sad thought that we can't trust others when we have to live and spend our lives together. In today's passage, we find David in just such a difficult circumstance. The heading of this psalm tells us the context, a psalm of David, when he fled from his son Absalom. At this moment, David is experiencing all three of the most humiliating things a person can feel all at once. His existence as a king was ignored. He was betrayed in a relationship of trust by his own son, whom he loved dearly. And many people pointed their fingers at him. He became a public object of criticism and ridicule, with people saying, the chicas sen spurs sunbad donzom occurred stan. How humiliating must that have been? He was the king of a nation, utterly humiliating. A son's rebellion against his father is perhaps a betrayal deeper than any other wound in the world. David loved Absalom. But Absalom raised an army, led a rebellion, and tried to kill his own father. David had to flee the palace in a hurry. Imagine how hastily he must have fled, perhaps barefoot and weeping. When he saw himself not in king's robes but in the clothes of a fugitive, not in a royal procession but as a refugee, how frustrated, confused, and humiliated he must have felt. He had become an exile, driven out of the very nation he had built. The officials he had trusted turned their backs on him. They began to point fingers, saying, God has now forsaken David, and God's grace has ended. The mockery of the people pierced David's heart. But David did not complain. He laid the entire situation before God. David describes the situation like this. In verse 1 he says, Lord, how many are my foes? How many rise up against me? And in verse 2, he says they mock him. Many are saying of me, God will not deliver him. Then in verse 6 he says, tens of thousands assail me on every side. What a frightening situation this must have been. An overwhelming reality was unfolding before his very eyes. In fact, at that time, to any outside observer, it would have looked as if David had been abandoned by God. It might have seemed like he was being ruined by God's judgment. Anyone who saw David in that situation, so utterly helpless, would have easily concluded that the hand of God's grace had departed from him, but David himself did not think so. Although he was clearly in a life-threatening crisis, he did not forget that God was still protecting him. So instead of giving in to the situation, giving up, despairing and turning away from God, David held on to God even more tightly. And then he makes this confession in verses 3 and 4. "But you, Lord, are a shield around me, my glory, the one who lifts my head high. I call out to the Lord, and he answers me from his holy mountain." Amen. What does he say? He confesses that God is my shield. This shield signifies a protective barrier that surrounds him on all sides. In ancient times, the shield was the most crucial tool for defending against an enemy's attack. David knew that God was protecting him from the closest possible position. It is a confession of faith that God, the Almighty, was still his shield. Having truly experienced God's constant protection in the past, David could not help but make such a confession. He knew from experience. He had tasted God's faithfulness, so even in this crisis, he knew with certainty that God was still with him, still protecting him. He continues, "Confessing God is my glory." This is a declaration that is worth an honor come from God alone. In that humiliating moment, chased out by his own son, his circumstances were miserable and shabby. But David recognized a deeper truth. His situation did not define him. God was still his glory. And he confesses that God is the one who lifts my head high. We too hang our heads when we lose motivation or are struggling. It's a posture of defeat. In ancient society, lifting someone's head high signified the restoration of their status and honor after being shamed. This is a declaration of faith that God will restore David's honor, his position, and his status. So, David understood. Though his situation was difficult, hard, and bitter, he confessed in faith that God was protecting him, that God was still his glory, and that God would one day lift his head and restore him completely. This was David's conviction, born from his trust in God. Because David had an intimate relationship with God, he did not succumb to his circumstances. Instead of despairing, he praised God, knowing that only God could help him overcome. So he cried out for God's help, convinced that God would see him through. In verse 4, David says I call out to the Lord, to the Lord. This calling out is his prayer. If you look at David's life, you see a pattern. He overcame every crisis by crying out to God. He did so again in this moment, confident in the Lord's help, because he knew from experience that this was the answer. Brothers and sisters, David faced his problem with trust in God as his shield, his glory, and his restorer. He cried out, confident in God's help. We must remember this attitude. We must make it our own. What problems and difficulties are you facing? We all have them. But friends, our God is not just David's God. He is our God. He is my God. If we adopt David's posture and attitude, we too can receive God's help. We can declare, in my trouble, God is my shield. In my shame, God is my glory. In my weakness, He is the God who restores me. We must trust in God alone and cry out, confident in His help. This is what God desires from us. May we all be people who truly believe this. When we take this posture, how does God respond? Verse 5 says, because the Lord sustains me, God does not leave His beloved children to struggle alone. He sustains us. Look at verse 7. Strike all my enemies on the jaw, break the teeth of the wicked. This is poetic language showing that God Himself will deal with the opposition. Notice, the psalmist's hope isn't in his own strength, but in the Lord's action. The method may vary, but the crucial fact is this. God will be our vindicator. He will resolve it. And finally, in verse 8, David's prayer expands beyond himself. May your blessing be on your people. He concludes by praying for God's blessing to be upon all of us. Friends, David lost almost everything. He lost his kingship, his honor, his loved ones, and the loyalty of his own son. But he did not lose God, and he did not lose his faith in God. What difficulties are you facing? Whatever they are, take heart. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Today let us look to the Lord who sustains us, who deals with our troubles, and who blesses us. May you have a day and a week where you hold fast to the Lord and move forward in His strength.